abandoning from Love and Death 13. Welcome back to Hybrid Theory. I'm Aurian Archive, and once again, we're starting with another Hybrid Theory. So what if it's mechanical? In the previous live streams, I covered some of the basic design flaws that were made when City of Heroes started, some of the ways that those flaws were addressed and fixed over the years, and some of the aspects on how currently existing issues could better be dealt with. However, what I didn't go into last night, and I kept hinting at it over and over, was how the Cryptic developers accidentally did set a precedent that would actually have been more helpful if that precedent had been expanded upon. And to try and make this clear, we're going to start off with some boxes. And get into our supergroup base here, just so I have a character available. And come back and we'll do this box and we'll start. I just realized the overlay colors aren't showing up. Oh well. Alright, box down. And we'll go with that. Okay. And now we're going to start adding in some text, and we'll do Tanker Gauntlet. And text, Blaster, Defiance. Defender, Vigilance. Controller, Containment. And at last, Scrapper. I'm pretty sure it's not actually called Critical Strike, but I am drawing a blank on what it may be called. Or it may actually be Critical Strike. Now this is one of those, why don't I just check Paragon Wiki? And Scrapper. Okay, the inherent, what's the inherent? Okay, not Critical Strike, Critical Hit. Wow. Alright, Critical Hit. Now, going over, the thing is about these, I'm going to kind of go down what each one does. Gauntlet is kind of an AoE taunt. Every time you hit an enemy, you automatically preform a taunt. You've already seen this on previous live streams with Pandemonia, where every time Pandemonia hits a target, like a flash of exclamation marks or a prompt of some kind goes off over the group, indicating that they have all been taunted. Blasters get Defiance, which is a stacking damage. The more a blaster attacks, the more damage that they do, but Defiance also gives blasters they can use, as discussed in previous live streams, their primary T1, their primary T2, and their secondary T1 powers at any time. Defenders get Vigilance, which presently, as the defender the smaller the team is on, the greater damage boost a defender gets. And there's a trade-off on an endurance reduction. And it's been changed, so let's go look it up and see if Paragon Wiki actually has a better description. Inherent power, Vigilance. And the percentage based on team size. Okay, at level 20 plus, solo, a defender gets 30% base damage increase. One teammate 20%, two teammates 10%. And they also get an endurance discount. And this chart can be found here. Alright, and basically as the problem was with the what was termed negligence, the original defender inherent, is that it depended on defenders got bonuses as teammates' health fell. Well, if you were a defender who was very good at keeping your teammates' health up, you would never be able to benefit from the original negligence, because there would never be a condition in which you would benefit from it. But if you were a defender who couldn't keep teammates' health up because maybe you were a buff set, you didn't have a heal, maybe you were like Storm and most of your powers were, if you've never played a Storm really doesn't have much to actually affect teammates. Or if you were like a Trick Arrow, you didn't really have anything to affect teammates. And, if you were a Radiation Emission, sure, you got 1 PBAOE heal, but other than that, it's pretty much all the buffs on the opposing target. There's nothing there really to help your teammates. You might be able to heal one person, but not all that much. So the original negligence didn't really do anything to give any kind of actual endurance discount to the archetypes or characters that actually needed it. Or rather, the defenders. Well, I can use archetypes here because if you were a defender and you needed to get off multiple heals in a row, let's say you're a Radiation Emission, and your heal, if you click your heal on auto, you can kiss your endurance goodbye. Your teammate's health is going down. If you had a better endurance discount, you could get your heal going off earlier, quicker, and be able to heal your teammate before they get splattered. But if your endurance discount wasn't kicking in until your teammate was already at 1/6 health or lower, and they were still taking damage, there's just no way you could get in there, auto your heal, and bring your teammate back up to health before they got splatted. It just never worked. So issue 17, that was when negligence was changed into vigilant. They got the buff to damage output. Defenders still get an endurance discount, but I believe that the curves were adjusted a little bit in 2017 as well to make it less obnoxiously bad at you have to wait until your teammates are nearly dead before you actually get a meaningful discount. Servers just shut down for a patch. Oh well. Hey. Okay, so going over, then there's controller containment. Now, containment is described as double damage. And what that means is that controllers do extra damage to any target that is already mezzed, as mezz defined as holding, immobilizing, slept, or disoriented. Now, there is kind of caveat here because a number of controller tertiary powers don't do double damage on containment. And they should. There are some tertiary powers that do and some that don't. When it works, you get a massive damage boost. When it doesn't work, it's very annoying. But again, it's a passive. It's something the player doesn't have to make vigilance happen. It just happens in the background. Players don't have to make defiance happen. The anti-mez on powers just happen in the background. On a tanker, gauntlet just happens in the background. Now, on a scrapper, with one of the recent ATOs, you do get a power that technically can force a critical hit, but is an ATO and not part of the critical hit inherent. For the most part, critical hit damage is a passive. The scrapper doesn't have to do anything to force critical hit to occur. Now let's talk about the villain side. Brutes get Fury. And Brute. Fury is a stacking damage. fury, or we'll do stacking damage. Brute's Fury is entirely mechanical. You must attack to do extra damage. And then you have the Scrapper. I'm sorry, not Scrapper. Stalker. And they get, what's it called? Okay, it's called Assassin. I'm about to go. Is that the critical strike? No. Uh, Assassination, and Assassination was revamped, and I've talked about this in previous streams. Assassination was revamped into Assassination Focus. So we have Assassination AF. Assassination Focus. And what that means is punch, 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 3 punches, you get your critical strike or assassin strike at maximum power. Again, this is a mechanical stacking damage. Okay, then you have Masterminds, and Masterminds get Supremacy, which technically is a passive power in that it always gives a, okay, according to Paragon Wiki, it gives me radius of 60 feet, and during Incarnate Trials, it grants level shifts to Mastermind pets. And Masterminds do get some, they got a revamp, I forget when, giving bodyguard mode so that players who were, or pets who were close to the Mastermind in defensive mode, the damage is shared, thus making Masterminds actually able to, take some damage despite their much lower hit points and much lower stats in every other aspect, because it's shared between pets. So Supremacy is technically a passive, but Masterminds get pet control. It's still we got stacking damage on Fury, we've got Assassin's Focus, which is stacking damage, so we have 2 mechanicals, we have an entire set predicated around mechanical control of pets rather than no control over pets that defenders and controllers don't have. Alright, and what about our final villain types? Let's see, so we've got what's left, Corruptor and Dominator. And Dominators, well, they get, what's it called? They get Domination. Yeah, everyone else gets something that's named different, and Dominators get something that's named exactly the same. How hard is it to forget? Apparently, it's very easy for me to forget. Okay, so Dominators get Domination, which is a fillable bar you attack to build Dom. Again, it's a mechanical. The player has to do something. Player has control of pets on Mastermind. The player tells the pets what to do. The player builds Domination. The player builds Assassin Focus. The player builds Fury. And then we get to Corruptors. And what do Corruptors get? They get Scourge, which is double damage on HP fall. What that means is that as the Corruptor gets lower and lower the enemy that they're targeting, the lower the enemy's health, the more damage a Corruptor does. Now, this actually is problematic, and this is really where this started at. So we're going to do an arrow. And we're going to go to a black box. Actually, we're going to do the black box down here, because this is going to be the important bit. Alright, box. Black. There are no scenarios Now, since you probably don't feel like reading it, there are no scenarios in which a Corruptor's damage scales fast enough with Scourge to outdamage a solo defender with 30% base damage buff. The thing is, when when the live devs revamped Vigilance, when they went from Negligence, which did nothing for most defenders, to Vigilance, well, Negligence. Alright, there we go. When the live devs converted from Negligence to Vigilance, what they didn't do is they didn't adjust Corruptors at the same time. Now, most of the other sets have had some kind of stacking damage. Gauntlet was just revamped very recently to be an actual inherent power. Defiance had been revamped My cat has decided to inform me that I am sitting in his chair. Either that or a raccoon has decided to join the party. Okay, and I now also know that the fan down there isn't turned on. Okay. Controllers. Well, containment has, as far as I can remember, never been revamped. Now, some tertiaries need to be enabled to strike with containment damage, but that's just, I think, simply reflagging the powers to do containment damage. Scrapper's critical hit, I don't think it's ever been... I don't think it's ever been adjusted. I mean, it's been improved with the ATOs, but the power itself has never really undergone a revamp, or at least not one that I remember. So we'll just tag these revamped. Alright, this one revamped. This one definitely revamped. Needs tertiary flags. Never revamped. Okay. Brutes, Fury, stacking damage. This has been revamped. Rebalanced for, and I've talked about this before. And we'll free up some room here for these slides. Okay, and we will do you. And do our little arrow. And let's see, we went with that purple. So we'll go with this purple. And revamp decay. Revamp cap. Okay. Okay. So revamped cap, revamped delay. And stalker assassination focus. Okay. And we got text, more predictable damage output AS useful outside of hide. Yeah, my cat is now definitely saying that I'm sitting in a chair. Okay, supremacy. And this was revamped for bodyguard mode. Taking damage. Better pet AI. Or better pet SI, synthetic intelligence. Okay, Dominators. And their major revamp was actually years ago. And that was to, okay, first of all, color. Remove damage component from DOM. Buff powers directly. So basically, when Dominators first launched with Domination, the damage bonus to a Dominator was tied in Domination. The more Domination you could push, the more times you could stack it, the more damage that you would do. Eventually that was changed so that Dominators had a consistent amount of damage, and simply achieving perma-domination affected the magnitude of their controls and gave Dominators anti-mez. And there's a lot of people who say, well, it was a nerf, and as someone who's a little bit more on the outside from a balance and design perspective, placing the damage bonus and domination to begin with was probably a mistake. The making all the powers damage equally makes it a lot easier to balance the characters, and makes it a lot easier to find value in having an attack chain rather than just running up all recharge triple domination and just having one attack that you just put on spam because it's doing higher DPS than everything else. Okay, so what have Corruptors gotten? Yeah, that's right. The Corruptors have never actually had a revamp to Scourge. There's never been a change. And I'm kind of looking, making sure I understand the background here, because it's been a while since I've had looked at this. But Scourge has never been revamped. Now, when Negligence was revamped into Vigilance, giving defenders a buff that really benefited all defenders, because all defenders have an attack set. And if you're running with a small team, you can definitely focus on your attacks more often than your buffs or debuffs. And if you're on a larger team, your buffs and debuffs you get more benefit. Your team benefits more from the buff debuffs that a defender can bring, even if all the defender is doing is just weakening the enemy. Even if they don't really have a lot to buff the players. And even one of the worst buff-debuff sets, Trick Arrow, that got revamped recently with the updated EMP Arrow, giving Trick Arrow a way to have a mobile anti-mez, mobile plus resist field that they can shoot anywhere on the battlefield. You add in some range enhancements, and if you see somebody who's getting owned by a general in ITF in like the canyon fight, you can be flying up above and you can fire your EMP arrow and give your teammates who are still on the ground fighting the generals a resist and anti-mez buff. Boom, done. you don't have to get close. It's actually, the live developers were very worried about making large scale ranged anti-mezzes because there are situations that can fundamentally possibly break the balance of the game. So giving that to MP arrows makes Trick Arrow one of the most valuable sets to bring to certain fights. Another good example is the the Khan fight against Reichsman and the Barracuda fight against Reichsman. Reichsman has a Keep me for a second. Reichsman has what I think is called the Fist of Tyranny attack, Fist of Tyranny, where you strike the ground, lightning strikes all around. It's a massive stun. Most players, most buff types have to stay outside of the range of this power, but with a Trick Arrow, you can stay outside the range and still give anti-mez to your teammates, who every teammate, you not having to target back and forth between them, you just fire EMP Arrow and now you've got everyone's anti-mezzed. So that was actually a pretty big buff, a pretty big change. And that kind of works into, there's not really a bad defender set now, or a bad buff debuff set, aside from, well, traps, but traps is a mess in and of itself that I'm not sure there's an easy way to address. I'm sure there's got to be a way to fix traps. I just haven't figured it out. Of course, take that as you will. If I can't figure out, what are the chances anyone else can? Not good. So, alright, getting back to Corruptors. Corruptors haven't ever actually had anything done to Scourge. It's actually, out of all of the villain sets, it's really the only passive. There's nothing extra a Corruptor can do to build Scourge. There's nothing they can do to maintain it. There's no mechanical aspect to it. They just attack enemies, and then randomly, as enemies get less health, Corruptors start doing more damage, and that damage does not ramp fast enough to make Corruptors entirely competitive with Defenders on total value of buff, debuff, supply, plus damage. Now, there are edge cases. The primary edge case that everyone brings up is kinetics. Corruptors have a higher damage cap than Defenders, and if you're running a kinetics Corruptor, you can run your damage cap all the way up to hard cap, which is something like 500%, which in real game is like 4x damage. You can do effectively 4 times the damage, because 100% would be your base debuff, would be your base damage, and then the extra percentage over 100% is the buff amount, so call it 4x damage. And when you are talking a 4x damage modifier, even on a lower damage power to begin with, you still get more. A kinetics caps out, I think, at like 300. Defender caps out at what, 300%? Damage caps. Let's see what that. Let's just do caps. I'm getting slightly better with this keyboard. Okay, maximum debuff. Damage. Okay, Brutes have a maximum cap of 775%. Blaster, Corruptor, Scrapper, Stalkers get 500% at 21 plus. All others get 400% at level 21 plus. So call it 3x damage for Defenders. So a Defender's maximum damage caps below where a Corruptor's maximum damage caps. So there are specific scenarios where a Corruptor can still outdamage a Defender. However, that's just it. It's an edge case. It's not actually a constant going to happen every time. So there are no scenarios in which a Corruptor's damage scale fast enough with Scourge to outdamage a solo Defender with 30% base damage buff. And then when you get into talking about teams, the Defenders get higher buff debuff values. And when you're talking with an entire team, that means the Defenders bring a higher force multiplier to the team than Corruptors do. So if you're running a full team, you're probably going to, be able to do without the defenders, because they're going to lose the vigilance buff as soon as you get 3 players or more, once you get over 4 players, the defenders don't get any more vigilance buff. And at that point, while they're still getting higher buff debuff powers, defenders are still more valuable than corruptors on a full team, and even medium-sized teams. And this is basically kind of presented a conundrum what to do with corruptors. So we'll do new slide, Control A, and function. Getting a little better at this. And we'll grab this box, and we'll paste it here. What to do about corruptors. We talked about how to fix masterminds last night, and actually having formations for the bots to try to adhere to, adding a pet synchronicity to the endurance discount, and passing on travel powers to the pets, which would make moving and working with a mastermind and other things. I don't think I added it last night. But like if a mastermind gets stealth, the pets get stealth. Yeah, my cat is trying to tell me that I'm in his chair. Either that or there's a storm coming. Kitty. Okay, so what to do about corruptors? We've been over heroes generally get passive, villain types generally get mechanical solutions. So what's a mechanical solution to Scourge? What could we add? Alright, and let's go ahead and just write that out. Maybe it'll, help us figure something out. Okay. What's a mechanical extrapolation for the Scourge inherent? What can we do so that the player does something? What can we do so that the player does something that directly affects the power of Scourge? Okay, does that sound like fair questions? What's the mechanical extrapolation for the Scourge inherent? What can we do that the player does something that directly affects the power capability of Scourge? Okay, well, we've got a root corrupt. Base root ideas, corruption, rotting. Again, this is where I kind of go back to thesaurus. Alright, we'll look up synonym for corruption. Surprisingly, Democrats aren't on here. Alright, we do have bribery, crime, exploitation, extortion, fraud, graft, malfeasance, nepotism. Still says Democrats one way or the other. Alright, looking down, we got crookedness, demoralization, jobbery, misrepresentation, payoff, payola, racket, shadiness, shuffle, skimming, squeeze, unscrupulous, finality, breach of trust, bribing again, fiddling, fraudulency on the take, profiteering, shady deal. Okay, that really didn't give us anything that's... Okay, we got deposing, go for rotting, we got decaying, decomposing, disintegrating, wasting away, decaying. Decaying, eroding. So let's just scroll down some ideas here. We got decaying, corrosion, collapsing. Okay. And we want something that's generic, not really specifically heroic or villainous. What's oxidizing give us? Oh, no, that's... Alright. Oxidizing. I got kind of hung up on this. Oxidizing to cover with oxide to take away hydrogen. Okay. To increasing the valence. Okay, valence. Okay. That sounds interesting. Let me roll down what just percolated through my head. We have oxidize. Well, let's rearrange our boxes here. Not sure how much of the screen real estate I'm going to need. Okay. So right now let's draw some arrows so we kind of keep track of where we're going and how we're getting there. So right now, we've gone from mechanical idea, what can we do to make the player does something, base root ideas, we look at ideas surrounding corruption and rotting, we need decaying, corrosion, collapsing, oxidizing to cover with oxide to take away hydrogen. That leads us into oxidation valence, or valence. Excuse me for a second. Okay, valency. The quality that determines the number of atoms or groups with which any single atom or group will unite chemically. The relative combining capacity of an atom or group combined with the standard hydrogen atom. I think I've got something percolating as an idea right here. So let's state something that is categorically true. And we'll go over and we will do a box. And we will give you that color. Cores do less damage overall. Cores do less debuff overall. Add a valence sliding component. So our mechanical solution is, and we'll call this go with this color to make it stand out. And alright. Valence derives from valor. And valence, what is the etymology? An origin of valence is first recorded from Latin valentia, strength, worth, equivalent to present participle valent, to be strong. So scourging valence, let's call this our new inherent, replacement inherent. Alright, and what does this do? What is this going to do to make Corruptors stand out mechanically from defenders? So let's define what we don't want to happen. Cores should not be punished for focusing on high HP targets for damage for lack of buff debuff. Cores should not be punished for focusing on high HP targets, so that means that if you're a Corruptor, you really need to focus on targets other players have already hit in order to maximize your damage output. You can make things drop faster. So if you let a Scrapper or a Stalker or a Brute land the first couple of hits, you have a much better chance of landing Scourge and finishing the enemy off with your ever-increasing damage ratio. So the idea of scourging valence then, the thing is, I've already brought up like the scaling method before, and it almost seems like when you get a new hammer, every problem looks like it can be fixed with the hammer. A simple sliding scale where Corruptors do more buffs if they have a the problem is that once you start applying buff debuffs based on target HP, that again doesn't help some forms of buff debuff sets, because not all buff debuff sets are predicated on the health of a target. In fact, most of them aren't. So while Scourge helps Corruptors damage as other players land first strikes, and then the Corruptors can start dealing out more damage as it goes down, there has to be something different than a sliding mechanical approach. I'm just struggling to think of what that could be, because I like the idea of the oxidation covering with something, but it's trying to think up of a universal effect that would be applicable to all buff debuff sets, not just the attack set. And that's the thing, is that vigilance now, coming back to this slide, vigilance strongly affects the damage that a defender does. It doesn't really affect the buff debuff components. And there's not really a good way. You don't really want to increase the magnitude or you don't want to decrease the buff debuff attributes of the player too much based on something that the player can't do anything about. And again, it really sucked on defenders when negligence only dropped endurance uh, if the team was at low health. I mean, if it took the team going down to low health for you to start cranking your powers out, then you you were screwed to begin with. There was no way you could. Okay, there were some ways, some specific defender sets, maybe empathy could pull it off, but for the most part, unless you were a heal only set, you couldn't really benefit from your teammates losing health. And if you weren't a heal only set, you couldn't benefit from your teammates losing health. Negligence was just a bad idea to begin with. And the easy way out is to think of a different. I mean, I like the idea of using a scaling component, but what would Scourging Valence scale across? What would be the mechanic? And the idea that kind of percolates in my head, and we'll go with this color as we work up the line. Okay. What if we go the opposite way from defenders? Defenders get a damage buff depending on the size of the team. What if Scourging Valence gave Corruptors stronger buff debuff values as the team size scales up and down? You still keep the Scourge component of the damage doing double damage, but Corruptors aren't drastically behind defenders when running in small teams. Okay, now what's the problem with this? Well, the problem is you now just created an anti-defender. Is a defender still gets strong buff debuffs and they get better damage in small teams. Corruptors now give you stronger buff debuffs, but they still do junk damage. And okay, so here's a second component to Scourging Valence. And this is kind of an idea that's been floated before, and I really liked it the first time I heard it. Cores hit more targets as team size increases. How does that sound? Your buff debuff strength is based on team size. The smaller the team, the more value the buff and debuffs have on Corruptors. But the larger a team, the more targets a Corruptor can hit. So each additional, let's just work this out real quickly. I may have to close these boxes in some. And we'll come up to this one. Okay, let's see. Okay, the tanker AoE caps were just like doubled, I think. We don't quite want to do that with Corruptors on all team sizes. So let's say that the average TAOE, the targeted AoE, hits ATOE equals 8 targets. Okay, cap TOE equals 10 target. Or rather, function equals 16 targets. Now, if we do, that gives us a variance of 8. Variance of 8 8 divided by 2 equals 4. Every new teammate, alright, TM5 equals 10 targets, TM6 equals 12 targets, teammate 7 equals 14 targets, and teammate 8 equals 16 targets. Now, this is where I don't really know how complex this could be to actually implement in the game, because I'm struggling to think of anything that has a variable target size where the target changes, or the target cap changes depending on other events within the game. As I readjust these to point to each other. And yeah, this is kind of, I'm pulling a Simon here. I'm using the act of readjusting to cover processing through the mechanics of how would this work. I should have moved that arrow first. Okay. So let's do a quick recap to make sure, or to recheck how we got from point A to point B. We started talking about the different paths with the different inherents, how mostly the hero side archetype inherents are passive, how mostly the villain side inherents are mechanical, and that the player has to do something in order to make the most of their inherent, that the Corruptors have never actually had Scourge checked, balanced, or revamped in any way, and that after the Vigilance change, there are only edge cases where Corruptors may be able to provide a benefit over Defenders. Basically, there's no reason to play a Corruptor. Now, so we start looking at what's a mechanical extrapolation for the Scourge inherent. What can we do so the player does something that directly affects the power capability of Scourge? And we base that on corruption and rotting. And we kind of, where we went from there is we came across decaying, corrosion, collapsing, oxidizing to cover with oxygen to take away hydrogen, oxidation, valence. Then we made the statements Corruptors do less damage overall because of the the math simply doesn't work for Scourge to deliver more damage consistently. It just doesn't. And that Corruptors do less buff debuff overall. So then we thought, adding a Valent sliding component, but then we basically create an anti-defender because if we work on the damage or the buffs, you now just, whereas defenders get strong damages when solo and strong buffs when in a team, Corruptors would get what? Corruptors are punished basically for focusing on high hit point targets for damage, but then they're also punished for focusing on low HP targets, because if you hit a low debuff target with a very strong regen, resist, or defense debuff, say like Cold's Benumb, and you put it on a target that is already at like a sliver of health left, you've now just kind of wasted a debuff that maybe could have gone on a different target. So Corruptors are actively punished for making use of Scourge as it currently exists. And there's the War Shade. Somebody didn't think this through when they were creating it. They really made it counterintuitive. The only way to really make a Corruptor work is to be focusing on only use your damages on low HP targets and only use your only use your debuffs on high HP targets. But as far as I know, there's no way to sort targets by amount of HP left. I mean, that would be a useful increase. And we thought, what about buff debuff strength based on team size? The smaller or the larger the team, or the smaller the team, the larger the buffs. And again, that just creates an anti-defender, and then we kind of went, okay, well, what happens if we change something else? What if Corruptors hit more targets as the team size increases? So that instead of the Corruptor powers only hitting a small number of, like a splash imagine for a second if Benumb was a splash damage power, that it, as you scale up, say you add for single target powers, you add a splash, and we'll write that down, and we'll do this in light yellow. For a single target, add a splash for T5 plus. So Benumb would now be instead of Benumb hitting a single target, if you have a full team, Benumb would hit 5 targets, because it would get 4 extra targets for teammate 5, teammate 6, teammate 7, teammate 8. Okay, that may lead to some balance issues, maybe. But you've now made Corruptors, you've now no longer punished Corruptors for focusing on lower HP targets, because they can be targeted on a lower hit point target, fire off their debuff, and if it's a single target debuff, they'll hit more enemies, and that way they'll debuff more enemies, some of who will be high HP targets, so you're no longer punishing the Corruptor for focusing on what they get the most damage out of. You're no longer punishing the team for having to deal with lower buff debuffs, and the team size has gone up. You're not changing the debuff magnitude, you're just changing the number of targets that the debuff can hit. That actually sounds like we've got a pretty cool it's not quite a mechanical, it's still more of a passive solution. The player's not having to click on anything, build anything to be more powerful, but now we've gone from Corruptors having no kind of revamp, no kind of rebalance, to now not being actively punished and being more useful in teaming scenarios where defenders bring stronger buffs to the table to begin with. And also still maybe being useful in, it's maybe do a trade-off. I still kind of like the idea of buff debuff going up down, or and the thing. The thing is, in smaller teams, it's sort of like you don't want to completely copy vigilance or the changes to vigilance. So changing the scaling damage, not really sure that's a good solution. Changing the buff debuff scaling values, probably not a good solution. But changing the cap targets that powers can hit make corruptors more valuable. Maybe not as valuable as a defender, but now you're no longer losing potential on a higher level team for corruptors focusing on what they're strong on, and that's taking down targets that are already impacted. Okay, so does all of that make sense? Have I gone from point A to point B? How do we get from so what if it's mechanical to maybe a passive solution where the corruptor doesn't actually have to do anything, but now the inherent actually does something useful to the corruptor other than having to specify, constantly switch back and forth between targets so that they don't waste strong debuffs on targets that are about to go splat and then have to wait a while for their strong debuffs to come back up. And I don't know. I'm not the one who's doing the power balancing, and I'm not the one who's really crunching all of the data numbers for how this would actually work. But it is an approach that may be, worth testing. Just to have corruptors hit more targets, not necessarily with their damage attack, but with their buff debuffs. And that change alone might be enough to take corruptors from there's no reason to take them over a defender to, corruptors can be pretty useful if you're doing like an incarnate trial, or you might have somebody whose hammer, I'm thinking right now of the behavioral adjustment facility where you've got a team focusing on siege and Night Star. And if you have corruptors who are tossing their single target debuffs on siege and they're splashing the bots around them, that now brings extra value to the incarnate level trials that presently where you really want a defender because of those stronger buff. But if you can get a weaker buff over a larger number of areas, well, that's pretty good too. And okay, it doesn't exactly... part of me, I don't like this approach because it doesn't really separate corruptors from defenders. Corruptors aren't doing anything drastically different. It's not really a different experience in playing a corruptor. But I'm not sure it's possible to actually make with what you have to work with. The thing is, corruptors and defenders share the same buff and debuff sets. Corruptors and defenders share the same attack sets. Corruptors and defenders share mostly the same tertiaries. And with that kind of limitation to the corruptors and defenders, unless you change something drastically, change the primary set, change the secondary set, change the tertiaries. And it's like give corruptors stronger armors or give corruptors wide area controls or do something drastically different in a tertiary power, just upend everything on the top end. But then now you have at the low range and the mid range are still going to be the same as the defender, and at the top end, well, now you actually have to get people into the tertiary powers. And some people, you may have a build where you might not be able to go deep on a tertiary power just to make a survivable build, or one that can keep up with just an average team without needing a number of buffs and applied to the player. So with those kinds of limitations in mind, I think that Scourging Valence, as outlined here, may be the best short-term solution to at least test, to at least look at and go, maybe this could work. Maybe it won't work. Maybe it's a dumb idea. But this is how I got from point A to point B. And if you want to follow along with that, you want to have a closer look at it, I'll be uploading the Impress file right along with the live stream. And that's really all I got for now. I'm Aurian Archive, and I'll